Okay, hey everybody, I'm going to go ahead and get things started. My name is Jenna Nilo. I am the Director of Marketing and Outreach with Illinois Digital Educators Alliance. Thank you for coming today. Today we are going to be hosting one of our Wednesday webinars with one of our favorite partners, Class Intercom. Taylor has been so gracious to be doing several of these webinars with us over the last few months. And today's is going to be how to advance your school's communication through podcasting. So in a minute, I'm going to introduce Taylor and Amber with Class Intercom, and they are going to take us through the rest of the session. But before I do so, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. So for those of you that have been here before, you've heard these, so sit tight. But we are going to keep everybody on mute today, including myself. I'll be muting myself as soon as I'm done here so that my dog doesn't bark in the background. Taylor's already today. And so if you do have questions, and please, we welcome questions, we welcome interaction throughout the presentation, but please go ahead and put those in the chat window, and myself, Taylor, Amber will be monitoring that chat window. And whenever there's an opportunity, I will interrupt with those questions and we'll get those answered for you. So again, please interact, please let us know what questions you have, and we'll get those taken care of. Also, at the end of today's session, Illinois educators do earn one professional development credit hour for joining us today. So stay tuned till the end of the session, and I will put that PDH link in the chat window. That link will be available till midnight tonight. So when it pops up, just go ahead, click it, and fill out your information so that you do get credit for joining us live today for this webinar. And I think that's all of my announcements for now. I will pop back in at the end with a few more. But without further ado, then I am going to turn things over to Taylor, and he is going to take us through how to advance your school's communication through podcasting. So Taylor, it's up to you.
Okay, thank you, Jenna. Yeah, we're excited to be hosting. This is our final webinar before IdeaCon, which we're extremely excited to be attending here later this month. If you haven't signed up, I know Jenna can get you guys connected there. But we're going to be diving into a topic here that is really one of my favorites to talk about, and I cannot do that by myself. I've got to have my colleague Amber Pankinen, who's joined with me here today, who actually hosts our Class Intercom podcast, which we're going to talk about, and why we feel like a podcast is really important to advance your school's communication, and dive into how you can start your own, and a lot of different things to consider when thinking about a podcast. But before we get started and I hand it back over to Amber here on our team, I'd love for you guys to go into the chat. We'd love to find out what role you are in your school. If you're an administrator, a teacher, in the tech department, communications, whatever that is, we'd love for you guys to chime in on the chat so we can really, answer the questions you might have from your perspective in the school of starting a podcast. And so if you guys want to go ahead and do that, that would be great. We're also on social media at Class Intercom. IDEA always tags us for these. And so if you have any questions, send us that. We'll share our contact information at the end here. And we're going to ask you a couple more questions here coming up. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and advance. Here's Amber. Can't see her on the video, but she is here. I'm looking right at her. I took the camera view here on Zoom today, but she's our content director and podcast host for the content generation. And Amber, I'm excited to introduce you to everyone here on the webinar.
Well, this is definitely one of my very favorite topics to discuss. So let's dive in. First, let's talk about the objectives for today's webinar. So one, we really want to talk about how podcasting can help communicate those key messages and help grow your school's brand. So whether you're communicating to your community, your parents, your students, grandparents, right? We really want you to think about what those key messages are. And then second, I think it's important to outline what are those barriers to starting a podcast, because as I'm going to share here in a little bit, I sat on the sidelines for a very long time before launching my own podcast. And so I know how overwhelming it can be. And finally, we'll dive into what are the best practices when you're considering starting a podcast. What are those things that you need to be thinking about in terms of equipment, the technology that you should be using? How do you communicate, about your podcast and get the word out? So we'll dive into all of that and hopefully get a chance to answer all of your questions. So a little bit more about me and my background. So in my other life, I actually worked in academia. I taught at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for 10 years in nutrition and dietetics. So I'm a registered dietitian by trade, but I also love social media and communications, and as a media consultant, actually to a TV station here and a radio station here, I wanted to learn how to podcast because I saw a lot of my colleagues who were podcasting, and I thought, you know what? The best way to learn how to podcast is just to do it, right?
Absolutely.
Just to start. So back in 2017, I started a podcast called Healthy Under Pressure. And I spoke with entrepreneurs and very busy people like Taylor here about how they stay healthy under pressure and, what are the things that they do that make them successful. And so I learned a ton during that process, from launching to executing to using social media to tell that story, to get it out there. And then last year, I think it was 2018 is when Class Intercom approached me and they said, hey, we've heard your podcast, Healthy Under Pressure. We would love for you to step into the role of hosting our podcast, which is the Content Generation. And this show is one of my very favorites because I get to talk to teachers, I get to talk to content creators about inspiring the next generation of content creators and getting to talk to people about how they create content. One of my very favorite episodes, actually this very last episode, we interviewed a show choir director who's also teaching digital media. And she talked about how social media is 140 character theater.
Yeah, so cool.
So great. So it's been really, really fun to be able to tell those stories. So let's back up just a little bit, because podcasting has been around for a very long time. I don't know, Taylor, what were some of the early podcasts you listened to?
Yeah, I just remember when I first got the first iPod, I think, and you could load podcasts onto the iPod, and it was so difficult. Apple now has made that so much easier, and now it just like pops up on my car while I'm driving. But one of the podcasts I've really grabbed a hold of is by Donald Miller. He's got a company called Story Brand, and it's just so good. And they're not overly, selling their product or workshops or anything. They integrate that in nicely, but it's super valuable for, someone in my position and role in life. And the problem with the podcast though, is I want to buy the book from their guest every single week. I don't know if they get a cut on that, but that's how good this show is. And I think you can listen to some shows like that to pull in to say, what could this look like for my school? And these are this is one that I listened to early on too, that I know had an impact on you with Startup.
Exactly. So back in, I think Startup actually launched in 2013, maybe 2014.
Yeah. Yep.
So if you don't know about this podcast, this was one of the very first that I remember listening to and just fell in love with. So Alex Bloomberg, who was a producer on This American Life, I think he was also on another podcast.
Yeah, with NPR.
Yes.
Yep.
He actually started this podcast called Startup. And it was so real and honest because it was his journey, his journey of finding his business partner, of pitching investors. And I just fell in love with the storytelling aspect of podcasting. And what's interesting is that ABC actually went on to make a TV show about the whole process and his story. So this is where I really fell in love with podcasting. And another question that we want to ask all of you out there is, what podcasts are you listening to right now? Maybe what are some of your favorite shows? Because I think that is actually part of the process, is creeping on these shows, listening to them, and trying to figure out what do you really like about the podcasts that you listen to that you could implement in your own podcasts. The other thing that I really love about podcasting is that you can podcast from anywhere. You know, our company is located in the middle of the United States. We are right in the middle in Lincoln, Nebraska. And it's great because we can communicate with our audience from anywhere. In fact, last summer, we did a live show from ISTE, and you know, this was an educator that we sat down with, and I think we talked to 2 or 3 others.
Yeah. She was from Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We talked to a few others, and if you've been to ISTE, you know how crazy it can be. So there were thousands of people who were around us, but because we had the tools and the equipment, we could podcast right from, you know, the expo floor at ISTE. So, you know, that's another reason why we really love it, is because it's mobile. You can do it from anywhere. So, you know, thinking about that with your school, right? Schools are located all over the country. You can podcast from anywhere. It also connects you with a specific audience. You know, for us, our audience happens to be educators, also administrators, students. You know, we can connect with all different aspects. For our podcast, we really are connecting with educators because we're trying to inspire them in their content creation and help them inspire their students. It can also be a learning opportunity for students. So we have seen some schools who have implemented those podcasts as a part of a class, and they've utilized that as a way to talk about communications, to put them in those roles as a writer, as a producer, as a host. And so it's been really neat to see how those schools have utilized that.
Yep. Yeah, one of the things I was going to add for that learning opportunity is students maybe don't always think that how important writing is with this, right? When you're putting together a show, writing out the questions, thinking about your audience, how much value you're going to provide. Those are all really great learning opportunities for your students. We've got some great examples of schools that have students hosting podcasts. And because of the technology, the ability to push out a podcast really easy through some of these platforms we'll share later, it's become just a lot easier to get that content out. But there's also some educational opportunities that we think are really important to highlight. So
it's also really humbling.
Yes.
I'll say that because when I started podcasting, I felt pretty comfortable in front of a camera, but then being behind a microphone, even having radio experience, I realized very quickly that I had a lot to learn. Because here, you know, the list that I have here, I found that I was saying, you know, nervous laughter, kind of those, using those filler words quite a bit.
I would say right.
And so it was a way to really actually learn from my own mistakes. And so this can be an opportunity for students too, because it's a pretty safe place, because this is not live. At least when we podcast, it's not live. You can go back, you can edit, and then you can share. Also with correspondence. So if a student is reaching out to, let's say, a teacher for an interview or somebody in the community for an interview, it forces them to practice those correspondence skills. So emailing, calling, you know, connecting with another person. And then also listening. This is what I found too. When I was interviewing somebody, I would get so excited about the interview that I would forget to shut up. So you learn to take a step back, listen, because that can also add to the drama of your show, and it can just make it better, and people keep wanting to listen. I don't know if you found that with podcasting.
Yeah, a couple things on that is sometimes you'll have a list of questions that you're going to ask, and you just want to stick to the script. If you're not listening to your guests, they may say something that takes you down a completely different path, and you can always come back to that. But that ebb and flow of a pod is what, you know, makes it so great sometimes for some of those interviews. I actually had an experience yesterday. I was with at an event with students, and there was a kind of an influencer there that was speaking, and these 2 students, they're a class intercom school, and they produce a podcast for their school. And these 2, they're sophomores, guys, and they're pretty shy, but you would, you know, looking at them, But they kind of came up to me and said, hey, this is what we're doing with the podcast. They had me on last semester, and they were not afraid to go up to the speaker of the event and go, ask him for an interview. And they stepped out in the hallway and they absolutely did it. And so what a great opportunity for these students to overcome maybe, if they are shy or they're an introvert, to kind of, express, themselves a little bit more through this. You maybe wouldn't, looking at these students, think, oh yeah, these guys would be willing to go up and talk to this person. So you just never know. We think improves these communication skills, like Amber said. So
right. Well, and it gives them a portfolio of work as well. And I know for us, that's really important for our schools, because they go back, they listen to our episodes. We get emails about our episodes all the time. And so it's a great way to showcase what is happening at your school, and especially those talented students that you may have. So I know some of you need data when it comes to launching your podcast, or at least asking maybe for budget, to start your podcast. So I have some stats here for you. We won't go into these in a lot of detail, but I'll give you some resources and other ways that you can find this information. So this is from Edison Research. This was the 2019 podcast statistics. So really interesting when they surveyed, Americans, looking at podcast listening in America. Now, if you were going to go global, you would look at Nielsen data, which we'll talk about in a second, because we have podcast listeners. We were actually just checking this today, where our stats, where our listeners were coming from, and they're all over the world. So it's a really unique way to connect with a lot of different people. So 70% of Americans have heard of podcasts. 51% say they've listened to a podcast. 32% are listening to podcasts monthly. 22% listen to podcasts each week, and those habitual fans listen to 7 podcasts per week.
I think we have one. One gal commented here, Heather. She listed several, and she goes, "Oh, so many and not enough time."
Isn't that the
truth? Been there, yeah.
So, are you a habitual fan? Do you listen to more than 7 podcasts?
I am not. I was for a little bit. People kept sending me different podcasts, and it just became too much. Even though I do drive a lot, I've kind of gotten into this weird mode where I just turn everything off, to be in silence, because there's always noise. But if it's I've got about 1 or 2 now, the Story brand, and then 1 more.
Right. And again, it depends on that information that you want to consume, right? Yep. So maybe if your kid's school had a podcast, you might actually pay attention to that because it would be relevant to you. Well, and this is the other thing too, that 65% are listening on a smartphone, tablet, or portable device, which is crazy high. And I'm not surprised, because when we dive into later on, I'll show you a slide in terms of, where they're listening, how they're listening. Let's talk about who's listening. Generation X actually is pretty popular when it comes to listening to podcasts, the millennials as well. Those are the main ones. However, I look at my mom, and she's in her mid 70s, and she is actually a habitual podcast fan.
Wow.
And I'm amazed, because she has her, iPhone 11, which cracks me up. And she has her podcast app, and she's got her shows, Taylor.
It's like her TV.
It is her
TV
thing.
shows, right?
And she has figured it out, and she loves
That's
podcasts.
Awesome.
So, I wouldn't say, don't stereotype, especially, when again, looking at my mom, she's a huge podcast fan. It's pretty equal. I mean, there are more men than women actually are listening to podcasts. When you look at education, podcast listeners are educated. A lot of them have a college degree, maybe a graduate degree. So you're talking to a very educated crowd. When it comes to where do they listen, I know for me, I listen in the car. So while driving, I know Taylor commutes from our office back to his home. He has quite a drive. And so he's listening in the car. Traveling, that's another big one for me. I know our team is constantly on the road, or we're on a plane, or we're traveling somewhere around the world. And so I will take my podcasts, I will listen to them when I'm on the plane, or if I'm in the airport. This is a health tip for everyone. This is what I do in the airport.
Write this down.
So if you find an airport that has lockers, you can actually store your stuff in a locker, and then you can walk around the airport. Minneapolis Airport.
Without your heavy backpack.
Favorite. Oh my gosh, it's my favorite airport.
And they charge you for that?
No, actually,
Depends.
it depends. It depends. So again, that's a great spot though to listen to your podcast as you're walking the airport terminals, or if you're working out. If you're walking, you're biking, getting your exercise in. That's a great place to be able to listen to your podcast.
And I think they should add mowing your lawn. Because I'm part of that percentage when summer hits. That's my go-to.
Right. Or if or if you're in the gym, maybe you're not necessarily on the treadmill, but you're lifting weights, you're doing Pilates, whatever it is, that also counts. And then of course, public transportation. Whenever I visit DC, those cities with the subways, I love to see people who are listening to their podcast.
They're locked in.
Yes. And so this is the awesome thing about living in 2020, right? Is that broadcasting is made simple because of our smartphones. There are so many ways to listen now to podcasts where, like you mentioned, the early days was your iPod and you'd have to download those. And that was terrible, right? It was a terrible experience. But now we've got Apple Podcasts, makes it so easy. You've got the podcast app right on your iPhone. Stitcher is another platform that you can use, Google Play. TuneIn is associated with Alexa. So I can ask Alexa, play the latest episode of the Content Generation podcast, and she plays it, right? It's amazing. SoundCloud, Spotify, and there's so many more. So it's easy access, which is why I think it's really important to look into podcasting.
And I'll say over the last 6 to 9 months, Spotify has made a concerted effort to beating Apple. I heard it on the news in being the #1 podcast playing platform. They're investing a lot in serving you up some ads that are geolocated type of ads for you. So they really want to be the best, and that's why they've invested in a couple tools, which we'll mention here in a little bit.
That's awesome. Well, it's a lot of work when it comes to podcasting. And as I mentioned earlier, I sat on the sidelines it was probably 2.5 years.
Wow.
I had the idea and I knew that I wanted to start a podcast because I knew that I had the skills to be able to do it, but I really lacked the confidence in terms of the technology.
Yeah.
I didn't really know where to start, where to go, how to move forward. And so I know that those barriers can seem overwhelming, and we'll dive into just a few of those here. So money can be one, finding the resources for equipment. Your school might already have the equipment that you need.
Dust it off and get that out.
Exactly, exactly. But even if you have a laptop and the microphone in your laptop might not be the best, but hey, it could work. You don't need to necessarily have a super fancy setup. And I think that's something that we learned early on. We spent some money on equipment and realized, wait a second, we didn't need to spend all that.
Yeah.
So you can definitely dial it back. You don't have to make it super fancy. Another thing was the recording space. Making sure that you have maybe a dedicated space would be a good idea.
Which is where we're at here in our office.
And even if you don't have that, honestly, it's okay.
Yep.
Just the other day, I was interviewing PJ Capozzi.
Yes.
And he's a superintendent
in Illinois.
In Illinois, he's out of school, and he's got kids in the halls who are running around. They're screaming, they're yelling, and that's just the way it is, right? And I think that that's okay. It makes it more authentic.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
So again, think about your show, the purpose of your show, and if there are kids in the background, it could be perfectly fine.
Yeah.
When it comes to technology, again, if you've got a laptop with a microphone in it, I think you're good to go, but we can give you some recommendations, right? And if you've got a phone, I know Taylor.
Voice memos.
Right, voice memos. I mean, you can seriously utilize so many different forms of technology to be able to get your podcast out there. I will say one of the biggest barriers is time, because it takes time to, one, set up an interview with somebody, right? To
figure out who you want to interview.
Who you want to interview. It also takes time to correspond with them in setting up a schedule, going back and forth, trying to figure that out. It takes time to record that conversation, right? We've had some of our podcasts have been almost an hour because we have someone who loves to talk and they have a lot of great things to say. You might have somebody who doesn't really love to talk. And so you feel like you might be pulling teeth to get them to say something interesting. So, you have to consider the time factor. Also editing, right? To go back and edit and to learn how to edit. We'll talk about some software for that later, but that can be a little bit of a barrier. And then of course the promotion factor. So spending that time on promoting your show. And we'll talk about how you can actually use Class Intercom to make that process much easier, but we know that can still be a barrier. And then confidence, right? Just getting up that confidence to be able to record your show, produce it, and put it out to the world can be kind of scary.
Everyone.
For everyone. The good thing is though with podcasting is you can edit. Right?
Yeah.
You can go back and you can edit. And when I interview my guests, I always tell them that I'm not a journalist. I'm not trying to, shame you in any way or pull things out that, might not be the intent. So, we really try to respect people's time and their wishes and make them really appear in the best light possible.
Also say this isn't necessarily a barrier, but when you talked about some of the things you were mentioning, people sometimes tend to open up a little bit more when it's audio, right? Like you asked me before this webinar, you go, is there going to be video? And I said, yes. And so Amber is sitting on the other side of my computer instead of in front of my computer, right? And so, and sometimes your guests are going to be much more comfortable if you don't have a video camera in front of them. And so thinking about that as well. And that's why podcasting, I think, has exploded because of the technology piece of it, and be able to connect. We're going to talk about some different tools you can connect with anybody. Like you didn't go to Meridian to talk to PJ. You're able to do that, over the internet, which is awesome.
It is awesome.
Couple things here, Amber. Amber from Idea, when you said Alexa, play the content generation, her Alexa started playing it.
Sorry,
so
Amber.
That is totally awesome. And PJ is one of the IdeaCon featured speakers this year.
Excellent.
So that podcast will be coming out in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks.
Yeah, not this next Monday, but the Monday after. That will be like perfect timing.
Great timing. Great timing. Yes. And I think, he's a great example too of a teacher, an educator, superintendent who actually can carry a conversation, and he would be great, hosting his own podcast.
Absolutely.
So, maybe try to, look at some of those folks who are podcasting. What are they doing right? What kind of content did they deliver? I think it's really important to look to that. So let's talk about pod fading.
What is that? Is that a word? Is that in the dictionary?
This may not be in the dictionary, but this is a common term that is used among podcasters, especially if you've ever been in this situation where, let's say you have found a podcast that you absolutely love, and then all of a sudden they've disappeared, right? And you wonder, where did they go?
Yeah.
So we call this pod fading, and pod fading actually does have a definition. So your show, if it stops after, I think the average podcast will pod fade after episode 7.
Wow.
So that is what pod fading is. Basically, it just disappears. And there are a few reasons for this. One, we talked about the time factor, right?
Yep.
Because it does take time to learn the technology, to produce your show, and then to promote it. It could be that you're not seeing a lot of ROI, so that return on investment that you've made. And maybe you're getting discouraged by the stats and the numbers.
Yep.
The important thing with this is to remember, are you connecting with the audience that you want to connect with? And if so, then that will make it worth it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, those scheduling conflicts, maybe you're not taking the time to plan and execute your show. And then simply exhaustion, right? Because it can get overwhelming. Let's say you're producing a show every week, right? That could get exhausting. So, maybe splitting up the work among your students or staff, or trying to figure that out, who can do what, can definitely take the load off. So let's just talk a little bit about the topic of your podcast and where you really want to focus, because what we have found is the more niche, the better.
Yep.
So right now, our focus with our podcast is specifically on educators. Now, we just launched another show. It's not a podcast, but we're calling this Content Generation TV, or CGTV, which is our TV series that we're putting on YouTube and then also Instagram TV. And this is hosted by Mitch Fisher, who's one of our newest team members at Class Intercom, and he has a really cool story.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that, Taylor?
Yeah. So it's been fun. We've had the podcast for a couple years, and now we've done a couple different things with guests, and Amber's been phenomenal with it. And we kind of had this moment of going, let's make it even more niche, right? Let's just interview superintendents, educators, and make it valuable for them as content creators. And so we're excited to just get that going. And then we realized that we were kind of missing out on an audience with that. And we really are passionate about inspiring and helping students learn how to create content. And Mitch actually came in and interviewed with you on the podcast. He didn't know it was a job interview.
It was his job interview.
And we had a connection. He was one of the first students to create content on Class Intercom a couple years ago. And now he's here at the University of Nebraska in the advertising and PR journalism school. And it just worked out for him to start coming on board with us to create some content. And he was a perfect fit for this idea we had for a video series to connect with students. And you can check that out. We've got a slide here at the end. But when we talk about, the more niche, the better, that's exactly what we've done. And we've had to go through several iterations of that to discover that. And it's been fun to go through that process when you look back at it. In your school, you guys might find that same thing. You might, be interviewing teachers and they go, actually, we want to interview community members.
Right.
And that's what we want our school to be known for, or alumni, whatever that is.
And I think it makes sense too, because you want to talk about what you love and love what you talk about.
Yeah.
So for me, coming from academia and education, I love talking to educators and learning about how they create content, what works for them, where Mitch really loves to talk to students, loves talking about content creation from a student perspective. So it really fits. So make sure you identify who is your audience. Answer that question, right? What do they need to know? Why do they need to know it? And what do you want them to do? And why do you want them to do it? Think about those questions when it comes to picking your topic. And then next, think about the format. So I know for our show, we actually might start off with both myself, maybe Taylor or Ben as an introduction to our show, but then I act as the host of the podcast. So this would be an interview style. You could also do other things. I've heard some podcasts who've done audio dramas.
Yeah.
And so that can be very entertaining. Maybe it's a cast of students who are getting together. It's a group, they're recording a conversation. So there are multiple ways in which you can, create a fun format for your podcast.
One of the activities you could do with your students, because it's so easy now to produce this, is to take a written story they've created and then, voice that over and add. And Ben has talked about this as well. Like, okay, you're talking about the basketball team. We'll go to the gym and have, the sound of the basketball bouncing in the gym to, add that element into your podcast or audio story, audio drama, whatever it is. That's what makes it, more interesting and helps it flow with some transitions. You could, the opportunities that are endless for, how you want to structure that.
We did a version of the Christmas Story.
Oh, right.
Last year on the Healthy Under Pressure podcast, where we had the whole team on Class Intercom reading different voices. And it was just a really fun way to involve everyone. And it was just different.
Yeah.
Right? It was very different. So that made it really fun.
That's awesome.
You also want to think about how often you're going to publish. Again, this can play a role into that potential pod fading we were talking about. So, daily publishing is really meant, I think, more for those news outlets.
Yep, I was just going to say that. ESPN has now a daily one and major news organizations.
Exactly. So those daily podcasts, there are some that are weekly. There are some that are every 2 weeks. I think the Story Brand podcast that we both enjoy, is that every 2 weeks?
It's every week.
It's every week.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, which is insane.
Right. And I think to think about that, Taylor, is that is being produced by, it's a brand who relies on that podcast to drive traffic for them.
Yeah, they do.
Right. So they have a whole team that is dedicated just to that podcast.
Yep.
So give yourself some grace in that too.
Yeah.
So if you miss a deadline, it's okay.
Breathe.
Right?
Breathe.
It's okay. Every 2 weeks, I know that is actually the pace for our podcast. So we just actually got started again. We took a little break for the holidays, but our goal is to publish every 2 weeks. We feel like that's a good enough time point in order to check in with people, where monthly might be a little too long. It might be a
Yeah.
little too long to go. So that's why we publish every 2 weeks. Finally, I would say be careful about podcasting at random, or whenever you have the time, because again, you want to establish a relationship with your listener. So do try to be fairly consistent, but pick something that's going to be manageable for you. And then next you want to think about what you're going to name your show. So again, this could be the name of your school and, including that in your title. So checking the website availability, of course, you already have your website, but are you going to build something external onto that? Checking social media. If you're going to use a different name that's not associated with your school, you probably need to get permission. You need to talk to administration about that.
Yeah, if you use your mascot or something like that, you don't own the name of your mascot probably.
Right.
And so if you call it Eagles Live or something like that, that's pretty generic. So, going back to that niche type of thing, I would do that with your show as well. So we made sure when we started the Content Generation podcast, we got that trademarked and got the domains and different things like that. So from a school perspective, you might have some students that have this great idea for a show, but make sure you're kind of having that conversation with them. So once they leave, you can continue that that show, and you can introduce some new students to that, or staff, whoever's taking that project on.
It has to be evergreen, right?
Yeah.
So that you can continue that. And then, does it make sense? Does the name fit? Will your audience get it? Will they understand? And then artwork, that's something else that you need to think about. So do you have some graphics that you can utilize already from your school? Are you going to make new artwork? I encourage people to go on and check out the artwork that is already on, whether it's iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you're listening, and look at what the shows are putting out there. So some shows will maybe have an image of an actual person. Yep. Some schools might include their mascot, or maybe whoever the host is. Again, I would encourage you to go and look and see what's out there.
Yeah, and I just was pulling up my phone, thinking about the colors that you have to make that pop, and when I play it on my car, it's taking those colors and overtaking the screen of my car, right? So you want to think about
that's a great point.
What it looks like on a mobile device, and it's really hard to see, but the name pops out and then a color. Don't add a lot of detail to it. It can be really simple.
Right. Which again, we'll talk about episode names here too later, because you would want to be able to see that episode name, right, when it comes up in your car. But let's talk just a little bit about recording and editing software, since I know folks have a lot of questions. In fact, the number one question that I get is, what do you use to record your podcast, right? How are you editing that podcast? So I use GarageBand. It's free software that comes with my Mac. It's already there. So I utilize that. I have found that it's a little bit easier for me to navigate, to manage. But I know some folks who hate it, and they would rather use, maybe it's Adobe Audition, which is a more expensive platform. Audacity is actually a free platform that you could utilize. Now, I think that one is a little more complicated for me.
It's Windows-y. I know we got some folks here might be on a PC, but it does work on Mac or Windows. I agree. Yes, I like Audacity, and I will use it for actually shrinking my audio file. And I can talk about that a little later too. Yeah. But so I use GarageBand mostly for my recording. I use Audacity to basically shrink that file size. Again, other ways that you can record: Adobe Audition. Now, if you're doing a interview that is virtual, Skype and Zoom are a couple options. And then I know you've played around with Anchor. Yeah, so Anchor's one of, it's gone through a couple iterations, and then they ended up getting bought by Spotify last year. And so, like I mentioned, Spotify's on a mission to take over podcasting. And so they bought Anchor, and Anchor is basically a one-stop shop for recording. You can trim, even add transitions. People can call in. You can call someone in their app. So they're really trying to take all of these tools, and then they publish it automatically to all of the platforms. So it's a one-stop shop, and it's free. And so we know several schools. The students I talked to yesterday were in Anchor, and they recorded it, and it was syncing, and they're able to build their show from that, put in the title, the description, and hit publish. It sends it to Spotify and everywhere. So that is the easiest tool. I suspect that will stay free. They have some advertising things in there, as long as Spotify doesn't intend on trying to monetize, using the tool. I think they just want more podcasts, because it's still, compared to blogs, podcasts is still much lower number than the amount of blogs out there. So I think there's still a lot of opportunities out there. So anchor.fm is the URL for that, and I'll put that here in the chat. So
cool. So other questions that we get are, what are you going to budget? How much does it cost to start a podcast?
Yes.
Again, I think you can do it for very minimal cost if you can utilize the tools that are already at your fingertips. Another question that you want to ask yourself is, how are you going to organize your content? We were just talking about this morning in terms of seasons. Maybe you've listened to a podcast that, Serial, season 1, season 2, right? Where I think it makes sense for them to do seasons because they focus on different stories. So again, I think it depends on the nature of your podcast. I know for us, we simply just go episode by episode. We don't necessarily have seasons because that doesn't really make sense for our show. Now, if we were going to focus, let's say, on one school for 10 episodes, then maybe.
But it makes more sense.
It would make a little more sense. So I would think about that. It can also get really confusing in terms of numbers when you are assigning names or episode titles. People can get confused. And so I just like to have it chronological, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, just so that people don't get confused. So I can point them back to, hey, there's episode 75, check it out. No need to specify this season.
I think for a school, maybe they could sync it with their school calendar. I could see where that would be applicable. But it depends on the show.
Depends on the show.
You're featuring alumni or staff, it probably doesn't really matter. Breaking that up into different chunks.
Yeah, I think, again, it only from a communications perspective is where you would really want to consider that. In terms of show notes, what show notes are is essentially just a blog post. For every episode that we have, we make it a blog post, and it's a show note. So we've included maybe a bio of that speaker or that guest that we're featuring, ways that you can follow them or connect with them on social media, examples of work that they've done. So let's say they've written a book, or maybe they have their own podcast. The reason why you do show notes or you have something in writing there is for SEO. Because if people are searching for that topic, hopefully they can find you, through that search engine. So that's why we do it. Now for school, you may want to think about that. Again, it takes a little bit of time, takes a little bit of effort, might take some coordination with your IT department. So again, you'll want to think about that. I talked a little bit about episode titles. So for us, we really just try to keep it pretty straightforward with the guest name and the organization that they represent. With my other podcast, the title is Healthy Under Pressure. And so I tried to correspond the guest with maybe their specific interests. So I think for your episode, Taylor, I can't remember what we did, but I've done, eating under pressure, sleeping under pressure, where again, we were interviewing experts based on the found themes. So you can get creative with those. Again, you could just put episode 1 and the person that you're interviewing. So it does not have to be complicated. Let's break into how to publish. Let's go through that very quickly because I think this is really important. So podcasting is very similar to blogging in that you have to establish an RSS feed. This is podcasting 101. You need to have that RSS feed because that is what you're going to take in order to apply to those aggregates like Libsyn, SoundCloud, iTunes, Alexa, right? You need to have an RSS feed. So what you're going to do, and this is where cost comes in, right? With a company like Libsyn, this is how basically we distribute our podcast. So through Libsyn, we've created an RSS feed. And so if you can go into, again, this is a little bit behind the scenes and we're happy to walk through this with you at another time as well. But this is what Libsyn looks like on my end. So they give me an RSS feed, and that's what I take and I use to apply to iTunes or any of those other aggregates. So one of the number one mistakes I see when you're applying to Apple Podcasts is that people do not specify the iTunes categories, and this is why the shows get rejected. So if you've ever applied to Apple Podcasts and you're wondering why you get rejected, it's because you weren't specific. So this is, again, behind the scenes. You want to make sure you go in and place your categories, otherwise you will get rejected. The process has also changed in the last year in terms of how you apply to Apple Podcasts. It used to be iTunes.
Yep.
So now what you have to do is go to itunesconnect.apple.com. This is where you will put your login information, and it will walk you through the process. It used to take, I think, Taylor, when we applied, I think it was less than 24 hours to get your show approved. I've heard now it can take up to 2 weeks.
Yep.
So
That's
this is
what
a
I've
part
heard
of your
too.
launch strategy.
Yeah,
You want to
need
be
know
really thoughtful in terms of making sure that you've applied just so that you have enough time, right? Because again, you may not have that grace period of a day or two. It may take 2 weeks. So make sure you plan ahead in advance. Let's talk a little bit about disclosure. When I talk about podcasting to my colleagues, this is a little bit different, but again, maybe your school has a sponsor. So this still applies because FTC, there are laws that talk about social media, paid work. So if you are getting sponsorship during that podcast, you need to say, this is sponsored by X company. So again, this is really important. And this is also teaching your students about digital citizenship, right? And how you are supposed to be transparent when it comes to working with sponsors and getting paid. You also want to be mindful of music and images. Again, we talked about podcast art.
Yep.
The music that you're playing, you have to be very mindful of this. So even in our podcast introduction, we actually hired a composer who teaches again at the University of Nebraska. He's amazing, and we really wanted some original music, but also we wanted to display that example of digital citizenship. So you can't just swipe music off the internet and put it into your podcast. So you need to be mindful with that. You could even have students create music for you.
Oh, yeah.
We've seen that. We have some examples of that. And I know Mitch, actually, right now, he has created music too. And so it's just really fun to be able to utilize their talents in that way. When it comes to content ideas, you can communicate about school events, news, maybe other highlights. Again, you could have students who are interviewing each other, interviewing staff. Our main school district here, LPS, right, they actually started a podcast. I know they were also looking at doing one that was focusing on health.
Yeah.
Because they have a registered dietitian on staff. And so she was looking at actually interviewing community members, staff, because she's in charge of wellness for 42,000 students, all of the staff members, right? And also communicating
How do I
to
get this
parents.
message out? Yeah.
Exactly. So, there are multiple angles and ways in which you can communicate your message.
Yeah, I mean, this is what you need to decide. When you're thinking about what type of show is probably not going all over the place unless you create them as segments on your show, right? And so when you're thinking about what that looks like, you're going to highlight maybe some events. You have maybe an interview, and then leaving them something valuable. Also thinking about, okay, who is my audience? If it's parents, how long should my show be, right? And are they consuming this? Trying to get feedback from them to make your show more efficient, right? And then getting that out to them and find out where they're playing it. Is it on while they're driving? Is it while they're doing something?
I'd be curious to know from our audience who's listening, what is the ideal time of the podcast that you listen to? What do you love? What do you prefer? I know some people really like that sweet spot of 15 to 20 minutes because it might be that they're going to work. I know for me on the other podcasts that I host, it takes a while for the guests to warm up and to actually share a little bit more in detail. So those shows can run for an hour because they finally warm up and they want to talk. but I know some people don't want to listen to an hour-long podcast.
Yeah, and
so
I think for a school, I think that I would go that direction.
Keep it
Is
shorter.
5 to 15 minutes.
Right.
Give them the information they need,
Mhm.
and give them a powerful story that happened that week, and get some audio from that student or that staff member, or highlight something. I don't think you need to. Now if it's a student podcast and they would do an interview, with staff or something like that, they want to go do more in depth. I think that's another type. So
Right.
so many ideas.
So many ideas. And, at the end of the day, Taylor, I think it really comes down to making sure you have a launch strategy when you are ready to get that baby out the door. So communicate about when you're going to launch.
Yep.
Tell people that this is coming, because again, you want to start building the excitement now. And once that show launches, that will actually help get more listens, especially when you're looking at those players like Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Alexa. I know the recommendation is to maybe start with 2 or 3 episodes already in the can. So have those ready to go. Because, I don't know if you've listened to a brand new podcast and there's only one show to listen to.
Kind of leaves you hanging.
It's a little bit of a letdown. So try to start with maybe 2 to 3 episodes. And again, being consistent is really, really important. So when I launched my show back in 2017, I think I'd been going for about 6 months. It was a weekly podcast, which actually was very painful at the time. It was tough to keep up with. However, I remember logging on to see my stats one day, and it was crazy high. And I was wondering, what in the world is happening? What is happening? Well, I came to find out that actually the show had been featured on iTunes. So cool. That's why I saw the jump in downloads.
Wow.
Everyone was asking, how did you do that? What happened? And honestly, I had no answers other than the fact that I was consistent, right? So being consistent again with when you're releasing your content, how you're labeling that content, right, with your episode titles. And then also, again, behind the scenes. We were talking about this today, making sure that you've got that data entered correctly when you go to basically that hosting platform. So hosting platforms like Libsyn, like SoundCloud, making sure that you're entering that data consistently and that you're accurate. And then finally, too, again, this can be extremely overwhelming, as we talked about, is that communication strategy. How are you going to tell the world about your podcast? How are you going to get it out there? How are you going to share about it? And so this is where Class Intercom comes in, because we can definitely help you with that in terms of scheduling your content.
Yeah, treat your podcasts like your social platforms, but promote the podcast through the social platforms.
Mm-hmm.
Put it on your website, put it in your newsletter. It needs to be everywhere where people are having contact with your school. And then, one of the things we help schools with is to allow multiple people to be able to curate and create content for your school. So they can compose that, they can drop in the link to the podcast, put in the graphic, and then it goes through an approval process, and it can be scheduled to go out in advance. And so if you guys are interested in that, we're going to be at IdeaCon here in a couple weeks. Would love to show you more of what that looks like to help share your school's story through social media by getting students, staff, administrators, tech department, communications department, all collaborating, working together to have a consistent message out on your social media channels. So thank you guys for joining us. Here is our emails. It's amber@classintercom.com, and I am taylor@classintercom.com. Please reach out to us. We're going to be giving Jenna the slides here. She's got the slides, and then Amber's got a one-page kind of PDF of the equipment that we have in our studio. So we're using is it Shure?
We have Shure microphones. So I'll share with you that list of equipment that we have, and I'll also share with you some of those specific steps. So when you're applying to Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, I've got some step-by-step tutorials there too. Yeah,
so to help you overcome some of those barriers, because again, the number one thing is, hey, what equipment do I get? Hopefully this helps you kind of get over the hump a little bit. And we'd love to be a great resource for you. And we've got a lot of great resources on our website, classintercom.com. Here's our new show, Content Generation TV with Mitch. I would love for you guys to share this when you get the slides with your students. It's built for students to consume, and we're excited about that. Before I hand it over to Jenna, again, we're going to be at IdeaCon, booth 621. Mitch and I are going to be there. Amber and Ben on our team are going to be down in Texas at another conference. So we're all over the place, but we're excited. We're going to probably bring some podcast equipment, the one we used at ISTE this summer. We'll have some video equipment and some lights. If you're interested in video, it's something we're really passionate about as well. And then we're going to be hosting 2 sessions. I'm going to be doing a session on the hidden opportunity of student-generated social media, which is a webinar, kind of an extension of the webinar I did last month. On Tuesday at 12:30, both of these are going to be in Schaumburg H. And then Ben is going to be doing a really fun topic if you're a tech director in the tech department, life after social media broke the internet. On Thursday at 1 p.m., huge shout out to Amber with Idea and Jenna for adjusting that for us. I forgot to let them know our schedule. So thank you guys. We're excited to be there. I'll hand it over to you, Jenna.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. As always, you guys do such an awesome job with these webinars. We totally appreciate your expertise and everything that you guys have to offer us and our members. So thank you. So before we finish up today, I just wanted to let everybody know about our next 2 upcoming webinars. So next Wednesday, we have one with our partner Makey Makey. So it's Makey Makey Beyond the Banana Piano. So what do you do with that Makey Makey besides make a piano out of bananas? So join us next Wednesday, February 12th from 4 to 5 p.m. There's a bit.ly there, but you also received a email probably while you've been on this call or this webinar today with an invitation, or go to our website, all kinds of ways to register. So go ahead and do that. And then the following week, February 19th, we are with another partner, TRA, Technology Resource Advisors, and they're going to be talking about what ed tech leaders need to know about school cybersecurity. So fantastic. They have an expert that they've had speak at other places, and really wanted to bring it to you guys with this webinar. So definitely sign up for that one as well. Again, all of these webinars and the webinars that we've done in the past are on our website at ideaillinois.org/Wednesday webinars. Tomorrow you will receive an email with the recording of today's webinar, as well as the resources that Taylor was talking about. We'll send you the slide deck and that sheet from Amber with information on the equipment, etc. So we'll include all of that in the email. So take a look for that. And then Amber, you've got me. I am an ummer. I'm awful at it. Every time I watch these webinars, I go crazy, and now you caught me on it today, and it's gonna kill me because I've done it about 10 times in one sentence.
The struggle is real. The struggle is real.
It is, because I just did it again as soon as I stopped that sentence. But
Saying, she was saying that.
I didn't mean to make it
kill me.
Yeah.
I'm posting right now and I'm like 5,000 shades of red right now too, just FYI. If the lighting was better, you could see that. But I'm posting right now in the group chat the link for your PDH credit. So if you go ahead, click that. I think I'm going to repost it because I accidentally put it next to a word, so it doesn't have the link there. There you go. Okay, so if you click that, it'll take you to the form for the PDHs for today. Go ahead, fill that out, and we'll get those your credit for today's webinar, so our session. So without further ado, if you do have any questions, Taylor, Amber will hang out for just a few more minutes, but I know we're at our hour mark. So if you do have any questions, please throw those in the chat window. Otherwise, Taylor, Amber, thank you so much as always. And we'll see you in 3 weeks.
Yeah, see you in a couple weeks.
Boy, in like 20 days.
Yeah, it'll be here before we know it. Thank you guys.
Awesome. Thanks,
I'll hang
everybody.
out for a little bit.
Thanks.